The day my wife called me a deadweight, I signed the divorce papers before she even finished talking. Most people think the worst moment of a man's life is the accident that changes everything. They're wrong. The worst moment is discovering who stays beside you after it happens. My name is Ethan Walker. 3 years ago, I was the founder of one of the fastest-growing logistics software companies in Texas. Today, I was sitting in a wheelchair beside a hospital window, staring at a gray February sky, while my wife stood across from me holding a manila envelope. Rebecca looked flawless. Perfect hair, perfect coat, perfect expression. The kind people wear when they've already made peace with a decision that will destroy someone else. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee from the nurse's station down the hall. Outside, cold rain tapped against the glass. Inside, my marriage was ending. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan," she said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Like she'd rehearsed every word during the drive over. I looked down at the envelope resting on my lap. I already knew what was inside. For months, I had watched her drift further away. Fewer visits. Shorter conversations. More time spent staring at her phone than looking at me. Some people leave all at once. Others leave in inches. Rebecca had been leaving in inches for nearly a year. "You deserve a better life?" I said quietly. She laughed once. Not because it was funny, because she couldn't believe I still didn't understand. "No," she replied. "I deserve a normal life." The silence that followed felt heavier than the wheelchair beneath me. 3 years earlier, a highway accident had taken away the use of my legs. The headlines lasted for weeks. Local news stations covered it. Industry blogs speculated about the future of my company. Investors panicked. Competitors celebrated. Most people assumed my career had ended the moment I disappeared from public view. Rebecca believed that too. Maybe that's why she was standing here now. "I'm tired, Ethan," she continued. "Tired of hospitals. Tired of therapy appointments. Tired of watching my life stand still." I nodded. Not because I agreed. Because I understood. There was a difference. She stepped closer and folded her arms. "Look at us. Look at what we've become." I glanced around the room. The flowers on the windowsill were beginning to wilt. The television mounted in the corner was muted. A wheelchair sat where a CEO used to stand. From the outside, it probably looked exactly like failure. "You're a good man," Rebecca said. "But I can't spend the rest of my life carrying someone else's weight." There it was. The sentence. The one I would remember years later. The one that finally revealed what she thought of me. Deadweight. Not husband. Not partner. Not the man who spent 15 years building a life with her. Just weight. Something to drag behind you until you finally let go. I expected anger. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Maybe because the worst part had already happened long ago. The accident wasn't the day my life changed. This was. I opened the envelope. Divorce papers. Clean. Organized. Prepared by an expensive law firm downtown. Rebecca had planned this carefully. She expected a fight. Tears. Bargaining. She expected me to beg. Instead, I reached for the pen. Her eyes narrowed. "That's it?" she asked. "You're not going to argue?" I signed my name. Smoothly. Without hesitation. The sound of the pen moving across paper seemed louder than the rain outside. "No," I said. "I'm not." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Just for a second. Then it vanished. She took the papers and slipped them back into the envelope. "I hope you find happiness, Ethan." I smiled faintly. "You too." She turned and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. At the threshold, she paused without looking back. "Goodbye." Then she left. The door closed. The room became silent again. I rolled closer to the window and watched her cross the parking lot below. She never looked up. Never once. What Rebecca didn't know was that I still controlled the company she thought I'd lost. She didn't know that every major decision still required my approval. She didn't know the board still answered to me. And she definitely didn't know that in less than 30 days, the biggest corporate acquisition in Texas that year would make headlines across the country. The funny thing about being underestimated is that it only works once. And Rebecca had just used up her only chance. 8 years earlier, before hospital rooms, lawyers, and wheelchairs became part of my daily vocabulary, my life ran on momentum. Every morning started before sunrise. The Dallas skyline would still be glowing in the distance while I drove toward our headquarters with a coffee balanced in one hand and a dozen decisions already waiting in my head. Back then, people liked to call me successful. I never did. Success sounded finished. I was still building. Walker Dynamics started in a rented office above an old appliance store with stained carpet, secondhand desks, and an air conditioner that only worked when it felt like it. My first employee was a software engineer named Kevin Brooks. The second was a college friend who agreed to work for almost nothing because he believed in me more than I believed in myself. We spent 18-hour days solving problems nobody else wanted to solve. Supply chain software was not glamorous. It was spreadsheets, logistics, freight routes, warehouse data, and endless meetings. But while everyone else chased headlines, we built systems that kept products moving across America. Little by little, companies noticed. Then larger companies noticed. Then investors started calling. The first $1 million felt unreal. The second felt dangerous. By the time we crossed 100 million in annual contracts, I stopped counting money and started counting responsibility. Hundreds of employees depended on decisions I made every day. Their mortgages, their families, their futures. That weight mattered more than the numbers in my bank account. Rebecca used to understand that. At least I thought she did. I met her long before the company became valuable. She was working at a marketing agency downtown. I was still borrowing money from my parents to keep the lights on. We ate takeout on folding chairs because we could not afford a dining table. During our first winter together, the heater broke in our apartment. We spent 3 nights wrapped in blankets laughing about how miserable we were. Back then, she never cared about stock valuations or board meetings. She cared about us, or at least she seemed to. Looking back now, memory feels like old photographs. The smiles are real, but the story behind them changes every time you look. When Walker Dynamics finally exploded into national attention, our lives changed overnight. We moved into a larger home outside Dallas. We traveled more. Invitations arrived from people who had never returned my calls years earlier. Wealth has a strange way of making old strangers act like lifelong friends. Rebecca adapted quickly, faster than I did. She learned which restaurants required reservations months in advance. She learned the names of executives and investors. She learned how to navigate rooms filled with powerful people. Sometimes I would watch her at charity events, moving effortlessly through conversations while cameras flashed around us. I felt proud. She seemed happy. For a long time, I believed we were growing together. What I did not notice was how closely her happiness had become connected to the version of me standing at the center of those rooms. The successful founder, the rising executive, the man everyone wanted to meet. Then came the acquisition offer. A massive technology group based in Chicago wanted to buy a controlling interest in Walker Dynamics. The deal would have changed everything. Most entrepreneurs dream about offers like that. I turned it down, not because the money was bad, because I was not finished building. The board argued. Investors pushed back. Financial analysts called me stubborn. Maybe they were right, but I trusted my instincts. That decision eventually tripled the company's value. It also changed my relationship with the board forever. Quietly, behind closed doors, new agreements were signed. Ownership structures evolved. Control mechanisms were created. Layers of protection were built around the company. Most people never knew they existed. Even Rebecca. Especially Rebecca. The fewer people who understood them, the better. I remember one evening standing on the back patio of our house, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky. Orange and gold. Rebecca sat beside me with a glass of wine, while city lights slowly appeared in the distance. She leaned her head against my shoulder and asked if I ever worried about losing everything. I smiled and told her something my father used to say. Real wealth is not what you own. It is what you can rebuild after it disappears. At the time, she laughed and called me dramatic. Years later, sitting alone beside a hospital window after signing divorce papers, those words returned to me. Because Rebecca thought she had left behind a broken man. What she never understood was that the most valuable things I owned were the things nobody could see. And very soon, the entire city was about to find out. The morning everything changed started like any other. The sky over Dallas was clear, the kind of bright Texas blue that makes the entire city look sharper. I remember standing in my kitchen holding a travel mug of coffee while reviewing notes for a board meeting scheduled later that afternoon. Walker Dynamics had just secured another major contract, and the mood inside the company was optimistic. Employees were talking about expansion. Investors were talking about growth. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally slow down long enough to enjoy what we had built. Rebecca kissed my cheek before I left. It was quick, casual, ordinary. Looking back, it is strange how life hides its turning points inside completely normal moments. There are no warning sirens, no dramatic music, no sign telling you that everything is about to change. Just another Tuesday morning. Just another drive down a familiar highway. The accident itself became a blur of disconnected memories. Flashing lights reflected across glass. Voices speaking somewhere nearby. A ceiling moving above me as hospital staff pushed a bed down a corridor. Every memory felt incomplete, like pages torn from the middle of a book. When I finally became fully aware again, 3 days had passed. Machines hummed quietly around me. Sunlight filtered through partially closed blinds. My body felt heavy, different. A doctor stood beside my bed with the careful expression people wear when delivering news. That cannot be undone. He explained the injuries, the surgeries, the long recovery ahead. Then he explained something else, something that changed the room forever. There was significant damage. The road back would be uncertain. Nobody could guarantee what recovery would look like. I listened carefully, asked questions, took notes. That is what I had always done when facing problems. Gather information, build a plan, move forward. The doctor seemed surprised by how calm I remained. The truth was simple. Panic never solved anything. Reality existed whether I accepted it or not. The faster I faced it, the faster I could adapt. Rebecca cried that day. She held my hand and promised we would get through it together. For a while, I believed her. The first months were harder than any business crisis I had ever faced. Physical therapy became my full-time job. Progress arrived in tiny increments. Small victories most people would never notice felt enormous to me. Learning new routines. Regaining independence where possible. Rebuilding confidence one day at a time. Some mornings I felt strong. Other mornings felt endless. Through it all, the company continued operating. Kevin Brooks stepped into a larger leadership role. The board handled public responsibilities. Investors received updates. News outlets speculated endlessly about my future. The strange thing was that Walker dynamics actually became stronger during that period. We had spent years building systems designed to survive without me. Now those systems were being tested, and they worked. Publicly, I disappeared. Privately, I remained involved in almost every major decision. Secure conference calls replaced boardrooms. Encrypted reports replaced office visits. Most people assumed I had stepped away entirely. That misunderstanding proved useful. The fewer people watching, the easier it became to move quietly. At first, Rebecca seemed supportive. She attended appointments, sat beside me during recovery sessions, encouraged me on difficult days. But over time, subtle changes appeared. She spent more evenings out with friends, more weekends away from home. More conversations ended with distracted nods and distant smiles. The warmth that once filled our house began fading like sunlight at the end of the day. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. That is what made it difficult to recognize. People expect relationships to break with loud arguments and slammed doors. Sometimes they simply cool a degree at a time until one day you realize the warmth is gone. I noticed it in small moments. The way she stopped asking about my therapy progress. The way she seemed uninterested when I shared good news about the company. The way her attention drifted whenever conversations became difficult. One evening, I watched her scroll through her phone during dinner while barely touching her meal. The silence stretched between us like a growing crack in a foundation. I asked if everything was okay. She smiled without looking up and said she was just tired. At the time, I accepted the answer. Now I know exhaustion was not the real issue. The real issue was disappointment. Rebecca had married a man constantly moving forward. A man commanding boardrooms, traveling across the country, appearing on magazine covers and business podcasts. That version of Ethan Walker had vanished from public view. In his place sat a man rebuilding his life one day at a time. What she never understood was that my greatest battle was not happening inside hospitals or therapy centers. It was happening behind closed doors where nobody could see. Because while the world believed I was recovering, I was quietly preparing for the biggest move Walker Dynamics had ever made. And within months, that move would change everything. The first sign was not an argument. It was indifference. Most people think relationships fall apart because of something dramatic. An affair, a betrayal, a single terrible decision. In my experience, they usually collapse from neglect. One unanswered question at a time. One distracted glance at a time. One conversation that never happens. 6 months after the accident, Rebecca stopped asking when I would be home from therapy. 9 months later, she stopped asking how therapy was going altogether. By the end of the first year, entire days passed where we barely exchanged more than a few sentences. The house that once felt alive now felt staged. Beautiful furniture, perfect lighting, expensive artwork. Everything looked exactly the same as before, except the warmth was gone. Some evenings I would sit in my home office reviewing reports from Walker Dynamics, while Rebecca sat across the room scrolling through her phone. We occupied the same space, but lived in different worlds. Occasionally, she would mention a dinner party or a charity event she planned to attend. Most of the time, she went alone. At first, I encouraged it. I understood how difficult the last year had been. We were both adapting. At least that is what I told myself. The truth arrived much more slowly. One Friday evening, she returned from a fundraiser downtown, wearing a black dress I had not seen before. She looked polished, confident, energized, more alive than she had seemed in months. She walked through the front door carrying that energy with her, and for a moment, I remembered the woman I married. Then she saw me sitting in the living room, and something shifted. Not anger, not disappointment, something worse. Obligation. The smile faded. The excitement disappeared. It felt as though she had walked from one life into another. How was the event? I asked. Fine, she replied. A lot of networking. Then she disappeared upstairs. Fine. That became her favorite word. How was dinner? Fine. How was the trip? Fine. How was your day? Fine. Entire conversations reduced to a single word. Meanwhile, Walker Dynamics continued moving toward the largest acquisition opportunity in company history. Every week brought new meetings, new negotiations, new challenges. Confidential reports arrived daily. Kevin and I spoke almost every morning. Publicly, I remained invisible. Privately, I was busier than ever. One afternoon, Kevin called during a break between negotiations. You should see these projections, he said. If this closes, it changes everything. I smiled. Then let us make sure it closes. What neither of us discussed was how useful my disappearance had become. Competitors underestimated us. Investors relaxed. Journalists stopped paying attention. They thought the story was over. We knew it was just beginning. Around that same time, Rebecca started mentioning someone new, a financial consultant named Daniel Mercer. At first it seemed harmless. She referenced him casually. A recommendation here. A conversation there. Apparently, they met through mutual friends at several industry events. I did not think much about it. Successful people often move in overlapping circles. But his name kept appearing. One evening during dinner, she spent 10 minutes describing a business presentation he had given. Another week, she mentioned that he had helped organize a fundraising campaign. Then she laughed at something he supposedly said. It was the first genuine laugh I had heard from her in months. Funny how certain details stay with you. Not because they are important at the time, but because later they explain everything. I never accused her of anything. There was nothing to accuse her of. But I noticed the contrast. She spoke about Daniel with enthusiasm. She spoke to me with courtesy. There is a difference. One evening I rolled into the kitchen and found her staring out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. The room smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla candles. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. Do you ever wonder what our lives would look like if none of this happened? She asked. I knew exactly what she meant. Not the company. Not the house. The accident. The version of me that existed before it. I considered the question carefully. Sometimes, I admitted. But wondering does not change reality. She nodded slowly. Maybe. That single word hung in the air long after the conversation ended. Maybe. It sounded small. Harmless even. But hidden inside it was a truth Rebecca had not yet spoken aloud. She was no longer grieving the life we lost. She was comparing it to the life she wished she had instead. And while she was busy looking backward, she had no idea that the future was already racing toward us. Daniel Mercer entered my life the same way a storm appears on the horizon. Quietly at first. Easy to ignore if you were not paying attention. The strange thing was that I never actually met him during those early months. I only saw the evidence he existed. A name appearing more frequently in conversations. A text message lighting up Rebecca's phone late in the evening. A sudden enthusiasm whenever she talked about business events she once found boring. None of it proved anything. That was what made it dangerous. People rarely notice the beginning of a story. They only recognize it after the ending arrives. One Saturday afternoon, Rebecca announced she was attending a leadership conference at a resort outside Austin. The event would last the entire weekend. Years earlier, she would have asked if I wanted to come along. This time she simply informed me she would be leaving Friday morning and returning Sunday evening. I wished her a safe trip. She seemed almost surprised by how easily I accepted it. The truth was simple. My attention was focused elsewhere. Walker Dynamics was entering the final stages of a confidential negotiation that could transform the company forever. Entire teams were working around the clock. Attorneys reviewed documents. Financial analysts built projections. Every day brought another layer of complexity. Publicly, nothing appeared to be happening. Privately, billions of dollars were moving into position. While Rebecca packed for Austin, I spent 12 hours reviewing acquisition models from my office at home. Late Friday evening, Kevin called. His voice carried an excitement I had not heard in years. The final numbers came through, he said. You need to see this. He forwarded the report immediately. I opened the file and leaned back in my chair. Even after years in business, certain numbers still have the power to silence a room. This was one of them. If everything proceeded according to schedule, Walker Dynamics would become one of the most valuable privately controlled technology companies in the region. Not next year. Not eventually. Within months. I stared at the screen while rain tapped softly against the windows. For a brief moment, I thought about calling Rebecca to share the news. Then I stopped myself. We had not celebrated victories together in a very long time. By Sunday evening, she returned home. Her mood was noticeably lighter than when she left. She unpacked, while humming quietly to herself. I could not remember the last time I had heard her do that. During dinner, she mentioned the conference repeatedly. New contacts, new opportunities, new friendships. Daniel's name appeared 3 separate times. Not forced, not deliberate, just woven naturally into the conversation. That was what caught my attention. People reveal their priorities without realizing it. They mention what occupies their thoughts. They talk about what excites them. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Rebecca spent more time away from home, more networking events, more professional dinners, more weekends occupied by commitments that seemed increasingly important. Meanwhile, our conversations grew shorter, simpler, colder. One evening, I rolled into the living room and found her staring at a photograph on the fireplace mantel. It had been taken years earlier at a company gala. I was standing at a podium accepting an industry award while Rebecca smiled beside me. She looked at the picture for several seconds before speaking. You were different back then, she said. I studied the photograph. Younger, healthier, more visible, more famous. Everyone was different back then, I replied. She nodded slowly. Maybe. There was that word again. Maybe. The language of regret. The language of comparison. The language people use when they have already started imagining another version of their life. A week later, I overheard part of a phone conversation while passing through the kitchen. Rebecca was speaking softly. The moment she noticed me, the conversation ended. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Yet something about her expression lingered with me. Not guilt, anticipation, as though she was waiting for something better to arrive. The realization settled over me gradually. Rebecca was no longer investing herself in the life we built together. Emotionally, she had already begun moving on. The divorce papers would not arrive for several more months, but the decision had been forming long before that. What she could not see was that while she focused on what she believed she had lost, a far larger story was unfolding beyond her view. Because 48 hours later, I would receive a call from Kevin that changed the trajectory of everything. And when that call came, the future Rebecca imagined for herself would begin collapsing before it ever had the chance to exist. Kevin called at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning. The sun had barely risen over Dallas, and the city outside my window was still wrapped in that quiet moment before traffic and deadlines took over. I answered immediately. He never called that early unless something important had happened. It is done, he said. For a second, I simply sat there. No celebration, no dramatic reaction, just silence. Years of work, risk, negotiations, and strategy had finally reached the finish line. The acquisition agreement was complete. Every signature secured. Every regulatory hurdle cleared. Every financial commitment locked into place. Walker Dynamics was about to become one of the most valuable privately controlled technology firms in Texas. Publicly, the announcement would not happen for another few weeks. Privately, the future had already changed. I wheeled closer to my desk and stared out at the morning sky. The clouds were painted gold by the sunrise. Somewhere across the city, thousands of people were beginning ordinary days without realizing an extraordinary one had already started. Kevin continued talking through projections and timelines, but my attention drifted toward something else. Rebecca. Not because I missed her. Not because I regretted anything. Because she had absolutely no idea what was happening. For years, she believed the company survived despite me. She thought Kevin and the board had taken over. She assumed my disappearance from public life meant I had surrendered control. In reality, every major decision still crossed my desk. Every strategic move still required my approval. The ownership structure we created years earlier protected more than the company. It protected the future. Even the divorce attorneys never fully understood it. Later that afternoon, I met virtually with several board members. Most were calling from offices in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. A few had worked with me for over a decade. They knew exactly how much effort it took to reach this point. One director smiled and said, "The market still thinks you are retired." I laughed quietly. Let them. Underestimation is one of the most valuable assets a person can have. People stop watching. They stop preparing. They stop expecting anything from you. That creates opportunities. After the meeting ended, I reviewed another stack of documents before heading to physical therapy. Recovery remained slow. Progress came in inches rather than miles. Some days frustrated me. Other days surprised me. But I kept showing up. That was the rule. Show up. Do the work. Let time handle the rest. My therapist once told me that resilience is usually much less dramatic than people imagine. It is not courage. It is consistency. I thought about those words often, especially now, because while my professional life was reaching new heights, my personal life had become strangely empty. Rebecca was gone. The divorce was finalized. The house felt quieter than ever. Yet something unexpected happened. The peace I expected to feel months earlier finally arrived. No tension. No distant conversations. No wondering what she was thinking. Just clarity. One evening I stopped at a small restaurant overlooking White Rock Lake. It was the kind of place Rebecca never liked because it was too simple. I sat outside watching the water reflect the setting sun while a warm breeze moved through the trees. Families laughed nearby. Couples walked along the shoreline. The world kept moving. For the first time in years, I realized I was no longer carrying the weight of someone else's disappointment. Across the lake, city lights slowly flickered to life. My phone vibrated. Another message from Kevin. The announcement date had been finalized. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until every major business publication in the country reported the story. 3 weeks until Walker Dynamics dominated headlines. 3 weeks until investors, competitors, and former colleagues learned the truth. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Then I smiled. Because somewhere out there, Rebecca was still building her future around assumptions. She believed she understood exactly who Ethan Walker had become. She believed she knew how the story ended. The problem with assumptions is that they only survive until reality arrives. And reality was moving toward her faster than she could possibly imagine. The announcement hit at exactly 8 a.m. Eastern Time. By 8:03, every major business website in the country had picked up the story. By 8:15, financial analysts were calling it one of the most significant technology acquisitions of the year. By 8:30, my phone had more notifications than I had received in the previous 6 months combined. I sat in my home office watching headlines appear across multiple screens. Walker Dynamics was everywhere. News anchors discussed valuation estimates. Industry experts debated future expansion plans. Investors praised the leadership team. And hidden beneath every article was the same detail nobody expected to see. My name. Ethan Walker remained the controlling owner. Ethan Walker remained chairman. Ethan Walker had personally approved the deal. For years, the public believed I had faded into the background. That illusion disappeared before lunchtime. Calls poured in from former colleagues, investors, journalists, and executives who suddenly remembered my phone number. Most went unanswered. Not because I was angry, because I was busy. The acquisition had triggered a series of meetings that would determine the company's next phase. At noon, I joined a secure conference call with board members and senior leadership. Their voices carried a mixture of relief and excitement. Years of planning had finally become reality. Kevin sounded especially energized. "You should see the market reaction," he said. "Nobody saw this coming." I smiled. That was the point. Sometimes the strongest position is the one nobody notices until it is too late. The afternoon moved quickly. Interviews were scheduled. Public statements were finalized. New partnerships were discussed. Yet through all the activity, one detail remained quietly amusing. Rebecca still had no idea. As far as I knew, she was spending her day exactly as she had planned, living a future built on assumptions that were evaporating by the hour. Around 5 p.m., Kevin called again. This time his tone sounded different. Curious. You are not going to believe this, he said. What happened? The Texas Business Leadership Gala moved up the speaker schedule. They want you there tomorrow night. I leaned back in my chair. The gala was one of the largest corporate events in the state. CEOs, investors, executives, media personalities, and political leaders attended every year. Before the accident, I had appeared several times. Since then, never once. I thought I declined. You did, Kevin said. Then today's news happened. I looked out the window toward the Dallas skyline glowing beneath the setting sun. Public appearances had become rare. Not because I was ashamed, because I preferred privacy. But this event was different. The acquisition had changed expectations. The industry wanted to see me. All right, I said. I will be there. The next evening, black SUVs lined the entrance of the downtown convention center. Camera flashes lit the sidewalk. Valets moved efficiently between arriving guests. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. The entire building buzzed with conversation. I arrived through a private entrance alongside several board members. Staff guided us toward a reception area reserved for keynote speakers. As I entered the room, conversations paused briefly. Not out of pity, not out of sympathy. Respect. That distinction mattered more than people realize. Several executives crossed the room to shake my hand. Investors introduced themselves. Reporters requested interviews. The atmosphere felt familiar, almost nostalgic. Yet I noticed something else. Across the ballroom, near a group of guests gathered beside the main stage, stood Rebecca. For a second I was not even certain it was her. Then she turned slightly, and recognition settled in. She looked elegant as always. Confident. Comfortable. Standing beside her was Daniel Mercer. They appeared relaxed, unaware of the fact that half the room was preparing for my arrival on stage. I watched them from a distance. Neither had seen me yet. There was no anger inside me. No bitterness. Only curiosity. Life has a strange sense of timing. Out of thousands of people in Dallas, they happened to be attending the one event where every assumption they carried was about to collide with reality. A staff member approached and handed me the final schedule. Mr. Walker, they moved your keynote to prime time, she said. The audience is packed. I glanced toward the ballroom again. Rebecca was laughing at something Daniel said, completely unaware. The lights above the stage slowly dimmed. Music faded. The master of ceremonies stepped toward the microphone. And for the first time in years, the entire room was about to learn exactly who had been pulling the strings all along. The applause started before my name was even announced. Not because the audience knew I was about to appear, but because they had already spent the entire day talking about Walker dynamics. The master of ceremonies smiled as he stepped beneath the spotlight and adjusted the microphone. Conversations faded across the ballroom. Hundreds of executives, investors, journalists, and business leaders turned their attention toward the stage. I remained behind the curtain, listening. Ladies and gentlemen, the host said, tonight we recognize one of the most remarkable business achievements of the year. A large screen illuminated behind him. Images from the acquisition flashed across the display. Headlines, financial reports, company milestones. Then a photograph appeared. Mine. A ripple moved through the audience. I heard whispers immediately. Some surprised, some confused, others impressed. The host continued. For years, many believed he had stepped away from leadership. What the world learned this week is that he never stopped leading. The room grew quieter. Please welcome the founder, chairman, and controlling owner of Walker Dynamics, Ethan Walker. The curtain opened. I rolled onto the stage beneath bright white lights. For a brief second, the ballroom seemed frozen. Then the audience stood, hundreds of people rising at once. The sound of applause filled every corner of the room. I looked across the crowd and immediately found Rebecca. Shock has a unique expression. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is absence. The absence of certainty. The absence of explanation. Rebecca stood completely still beside Daniel Mercer. Her eyes remained fixed on the stage. Daniel looked equally confused. Neither appeared prepared for what they were seeing. I nodded politely toward the audience and positioned myself beside the podium. The applause continued longer than expected. When it finally settled, I began speaking. Not about the accident. Not about adversity. Not about personal struggles. I spoke about resilience. About teams. About long-term thinking. About building systems that survive difficult seasons. The same principles that helped Walker Dynamics grow from a small office into an industry leader. Every few moments I noticed Rebecca watching. Her expression changed with every new detail. When I discussed ownership structure, she frowned. When I referenced strategic decisions made during the past 3 years, confusion appeared. When I explained that I had personally overseen every major acquisition negotiation, realization finally arrived. The version of Ethan Walker she believed existed had never been real. Near the end of the speech, I shared something my father once told me. The world pays attention to visible success, I said. But character is built during the seasons nobody applauds. The room fell silent. Anyone can lead when conditions are easy. The real test comes when life forces you to rebuild. Then the audience applauded again, louder than before. After the presentation ended, dozens of people approached. Investors requested meetings. Reporters asked questions. Executives offered congratulations. The ballroom transformed into a sea of conversations and handshakes. Nearly 40 minutes passed before I finally saw Rebecca moving toward me. Daniel followed a few steps behind. Neither looked comfortable. Rebecca stopped several feet away. For the first time in years, she seemed unsure what to say. "Ethan," she said quietly. I nodded. "Rebecca." An awkward silence settled between us. The noise of the ballroom continued around us, yet the moment felt strangely isolated. Her eyes searched my face as though she expected to find a different person standing there. "I did not know," she finally admitted. "I can see that." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Rebecca glanced toward the crowd gathered around me. Executives, investors, board members, people waiting for their turn to speak. The same people she once assumed had moved on without me. "You never told me," she said. I considered the statement carefully. "You never asked." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Her shoulders lowered slightly. For the first time, she seemed to understand the distance between assumption and reality. She had spent years believing she understood my situation, yet she never took the time to discover the truth. Around us, conversations continued. Cameras flashed. Business leaders exchanged cards. The future was already moving forward. Rebecca looked toward the stage, then back at me. There was regret in her eyes now, not because she missed who I was, because she had finally realized who I had remained all along. And as she stood there struggling to process everything she had learned, I knew the hardest part of her realization had not arrived yet. Because the greatest thing I rebuilt during those years was never the company. It was myself. Rebecca found me again 3 weeks later. Not at a gala. Not at a corporate event. Not in front of cameras or executives. She found me on an ordinary Thursday afternoon overlooking White Rock Lake. I had started spending more time there after the acquisition closed. The water was calm, the walking paths were quiet, and nobody seemed interested in discussing quarterly earnings or market valuations. It felt honest. I was reading through a report when I noticed someone approaching from across the patio. "Rebecca." She stopped a few feet away and offered a nervous smile. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved gently across the lake, carrying the distant sound of birds and passing bicycles. It was strange how different she looked outside the world of business events and formal dinners. More human, more uncertain. "I was not sure you would meet with me," she said. I was not sure either. She sat across from me. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then she looked out across the water and exhaled. Slowly. "I have replayed everything 100 times since that night." I nodded but said nothing. I was wrong about a lot of things. Her voice sounded softer than I remembered. Not just the company. Not just the money. Everything. I watched sunlight reflect across the lake. Years earlier, I might have felt satisfaction hearing those words. Instead, I felt something else. Distance. Not anger. Not resentment. Just distance. Time has a way of changing the shape of old wounds. "I thought I understood what happened to you," she continued. "I thought the accident changed you." This time I answered. "It did change me." She looked up. "Then what did I miss?" I considered the question carefully. The answer mattered. You thought the accident took something away from me, I said. What it actually did was show me what mattered. She lowered her eyes. The breeze lifted a strand of hair across her face. I wish I had stayed. There it was. The sentence hidden beneath everything else. Not a business discussion. Not an explanation. Regret. Honest and unfiltered. I looked at the water again. Do you know what the hardest part was? I asked. The recovery? No. I shook my head. The hardest part was realizing that someone could see me struggling and decide I was no longer worth believing in. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. I am sorry, Ethan. And for the first time, I believed she meant it. The apology was real. The regret was real. But some truths arrived too late to change the outcome. We sat quietly for a while. The conversation no longer felt like a confrontation. It felt like two people finally acknowledging reality. Eventually, she spoke again. Is there any chance for us? The question hung in the air between us. Months earlier, hearing it would have changed everything. Now it changed nothing. I smiled gently. Not because I wanted to hurt her. Because I finally understood something important. Love cannot survive where respect disappears. No, I said. Her expression tightened slightly, but she nodded. Deep down, she already knew the answer. Because of what happened, she asked. Because of what I learned. I looked directly at her. When life became difficult, you saw a burden. I saw a challenge. We were living in the same house and looking at the same situation, but we saw completely different things. Tears formed in her eyes, but she remained composed. I understand. And I think she did. The sun had begun drifting lower across the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the water. Around us, life continued exactly as it always had. Families walked by. Friends laughed. Boats moved slowly across the lake. The world did not pause for heartbreak. It never does. Rebecca stood first. I hope you are happy, Ethan. I smiled. This time the answer came easily. I am. She nodded once, then turned and walked away. I watched her disappear along the lakeside path until she became just another figure in the distance. Then I looked back toward the water. 3 years earlier, I thought losing the ability to walk would become the defining event of my life. I was wrong. The defining moment came later. It came when everything familiar fell apart, and I discovered who I was without the titles, attention, and expectations. The company survived. The acquisition succeeded. The headlines faded. But the most valuable thing I rebuilt was never a business. It was peace. As the sun settled beyond the Dallas skyline, I turned my chair toward the path ahead. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt lighter than the past.